behalf of the Center, okay, on behalf of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, we'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming to this wonderful filmmaker panel for Kung San Man Tayo. I hope I said that right, wherever we may be. We hope that you got to catch the film. If not, it's still available on our website for the rest of today. We'll post the link up in the chat in a bit. We'd firstly like to thank Adrian Alarilla, writer, filmmaker, and PhD candidate in history at Manoa, Kenneth Cardenas, right? PhD candidate in geography from York University, and their co-directors for reaching out to us to host this film. We've been following Adrian's work on Filipino migration for a while now, and so we really enjoyed kind of learning more about your and your colleagues' journeys through this film. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to our moderator, Maria Karaan, PhD candidate in English, also from Manoa, to introduce our panelists and take it from here. You're muted.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you for the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for hosting us today. Hi, everyone. I can't see anyone, but hi, everyone. And I'm really excited to have this discussion with Adi and Kenneth, especially because I first watched this film while Adi was editing it in progress, right? I think in 2020. And then I was super excited to watch it again last week in its full form. So am I supposed to introduce the two of you? I think like Sarah already did. But I do want, and Adi, Kenneth, and I talked about it a little bit yesterday, and we got really carried away. So we tried not to preempt this discussion, but we want to make this this conversation a little bit more in the form of a kwentuhan or a talk story in Hawaii. And I guess like to start us off, we'll begin with a really simple question, and I think Adi and Kenneth might have a lot to say about it. However, what was the impetus for the film? What started it, and how did it go?
Thank you so much, Maria. I've before I made this film, I've been making short films mostly about my personal journey migrating to the US and discovering the deeper history of Filipino migration to the US. But I was also curious about my friends' experiences migrating abroad as well, especially since, another aspect of this film is that all of us were at one point in our lives state scholars. So our education, either high school or college, was largely funded by the citizens of the Philippines. You know, when I migrated to the US, I was for the longest time I've been trying to process, you know, that guilt of moving and not being able to give back to my country. Realizing that a lot of my fellow Scholar ng Bayan, state scholars, also went abroad, I got curious about how they felt as well. So I decided to, I wanted to learn more about their stories as well, but when I didn't have any budget to go around the world and visit them and shoot them, and also two, I wanted to emulate, you know, I wanted to expand my own preferred format of a personal documentary, and have any of my friends interested in shooting and telling their own story to be able to do that. So hence the format came to be, where I sent my camera to my friends one by one until it basically circumnavigated the world. So yeah, how about you, Kenneth?
Well, that was the whole concept of the project, and I thought it was an amazing idea. Uh, what really sold me was I think initially had this idea of setting the camera on a voice, allowing people to tell their own stories rather than having the story of colonizers preempt how we understand ourselves, number one, and number two, how other people around us understand our country of origin. You had this idea in 2014-15 where you would release the film in time for the 500th anniversary of Magellan's voyage of discovery, right? And you had named the camera after Awang. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, or Christianized Enrique of Malacca, the slave that Portuguese traders captured in Malacca, who had joined the Magellan expedition. And instead of going on a voyage westwards of discovery, the camera was being sent on a voyage of storytelling. I'd like to put it that way, of us being able to tell our own stories. So I thought that was an amazing premise. So when you got in touch, I immediately signed.
So actually, I wanted to bring in some of the audience's questions later on, but I think Francine Del Rosario has a really good question in relation to what you were talking about. So she's genuinely curious how you got your friends on board to record their lives. Were they all willing participants, or did it take some convincing?
Yeah, definitely. That is a really great question, especially since beyond this being a documentary project, it was also some attempt at, ethnography or ethnography. And, except instead of us studying an other, we were basically studying ourselves and reflecting on ourselves. And so I approached a bunch of my friends, so more than the final list of participants. And I approached them. I was transparent with the project. I told them what the final product might look like, and what the expectations might be. And a lot of people said yes. Some of them backed out eventually, even before shooting. Some of them backed out during shooting. There were a lot of concerns. So we actually had a number of attempts of shooting in the Middle East, but ultimately it did not prove feasible. There were some concerns about the country, I think it was UAE, not being open enough, and them being careful about their own position, precarious positions in the country. So definitely only those who said yes were able to participate, and anyone who felt like they needed to back out did. And but I'm glad that the six friends who showed up in the final product stayed and shared their stories. Yeah.
Actually, just kind of jumping off of that. Oh, kind of actually, what would you like to add to how, if AD had to convince you to participate, or were you all in?
Not particularly. It was easy enough for me. Before that, I had met AD in Seattle. I had visited him and another classmate of mine, and I think he briefly talked about the idea back then. I was like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And it also lined up that I was doing my comprehensive exams at the time. And thing is, I'm not done yet. I'm like 10 years in. And even then, even into the second, third year of my PhD, I was taking a good look around me, and I was realizing I kind of don't want to be these people. So I did not like the person I was becoming in the middle of comps, like being so deep in the readings and not being in conversation with anybody else. AD bringing me in was just a great reason to inhabit a different mode of being for a few hours a day. It was amazing. So it was easy enough for me.
Hashtag relatable, Kenneth. I mean, Maria, I think it's relatable to you as well.
Relatable to me too. Being stuck in the reading mode for a long time instead of actually conversing and sharing with other people. And actually, so this is where I want to jump off from something that AD said earlier, as when he asked you guys to contribute to the project, you were all trying to figure out your positions, right, in your particular spaces. And I think like when I heard the title of the movie, Kung Saan Man Tayo, it is a rumination on position. If right, and when we talk about position, we're not just talking about positions in time or place or even or nation or state, but it is also a position in terms of your context and your state of being. So would you like to talk a little bit more about maybe the way that you titled the film and its relationship to the narratives that you guys were talking about?
Yeah, definitely a great question. So when I first conceptualized this film back in 2014, it actually had a different title, Where We Are Now. That was the original title, and it didn't have a Tagalog title. It was just Where We Are Now. And it was very plain, just kind of descriptive, kind of a working title. But when I was editing the film, so I was editing the film in 2020. Just going back to your point, Kenneth, I was in the middle of my comps like reading phase at the time as well, and of course at the same time it was the pandemic. I was feeling really isolated. I couldn't even see Maria and my other friends on campus. So in the midst of reading and studying, I did this kind of during my free time. I revisited the project and revisited the footage, and I initially when I first started editing back in 2016, I didn't know how to tie everything together, how to structure it all in a cohesive way, and somehow it kind of took the pandemic to give me that inspiration to structure it the way I did and retitle it as Wherever We May Be, Kung Saan Man Tayo, which talks not only about position but also about movement, because our positions are constantly in motion even if we are staying in the same country. And so wherever we may be is it's not just where we are now. It's like trying to capture this this uncertainty of position, because you don't know, you are not sure where you are now, but wherever you may be, you're there. Something like that. Yeah. Kenneth, do you want to say a bit more?
Not sure. I'll hold on for now. Yeah. I think there's a few questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like thank you to Sonia Zabala for this question. I think it again works really well with this discussion. How did you feel about sharing your stories? How did you negotiate your positionality? And where do you see your narrative reshaping Filipino history in this world? Big question.
Thank you, Sonia. That's a big question, definitely. I'd like to ask Kenneth first, since he was one of the participants.
Okay. I'll keep the question in the corner of my screen. How did you feel about sharing your stories? Initially, I felt like I did not want the focus to be on me. I posed a headache actually for AD, I think, in editing, because I sent him gigabytes of footage, and a lot of it was in the form of interviews of the Filipinx community here. My thinking at that time was, I'm in a position to tell other people's stories, and my story isn't that interesting anyway. I think a lot of that footage was not really used for the final cut. AD and I and our correspondents and our interlocutors will find another way, I think, to tell those stories, because I think they are very important stories. Toronto is an amazing in an amazing time and space right now with respect to defining and redefining what it means to be Filipino, Filipinx, Filipina. How did you negotiate on my positionality? Yeah, it was the same. I was trying to shunt the focus away from myself rather than to myself. But in the process of making the film, I gradually, over the course of the past few years, became more comfortable with speaking in the first person. And I think that speaks to the last question of the three questions. My own narrative reshaping Filipino history and diaspora. Making the film sort of set me on a path of paying more attention to peoples and histories and ways of being that I have in common with other colonized, dispossessed peoples of the world. You know, like it's I now see myself not necessarily as Filipino exclusively, but as part of an archipelago of dispossessed peoples. And it just so happens that the Philippines is an archipelagic country. There's a little bit of experience that I can work with respect to relating to other members of this archipelago across the planet. So it's not just about, if I were to see, if I were to inhabit a subjectivity of the leading character of my own film, I think I'd like to inhabit the subjectivity of a messenger between these islands, you know. And I think AD's film helped me get started on that path.
I mean,
awesome.
Kenneth and I like briefly discussed this shared interest in the notion of archipelagity, and I'm actually very interested also in your idea of being the messenger in this kind of transit, right, among different spaces where Filipinos and diasporic Filipinos kind of reside. But at the same time, I also wanted to ask, and this is just going back a little bit on the camera. You named him after you named them after after Enrique, right? And I'm thinking of the camera, therefore, at this point, as a very important character in the film that takes the place of you, AD, right, as the filmmaker in traveling from one space to another. Could you tell me more about the camera? And actually, Kenneth, this is actually an interesting like thought for me. When the camera arrived, did you treat the camera as a character or a stand-in for AD, or just a mere device? So either of you could start.
Okay. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, so I did name the character after Enrique de Melaca, and I know that Sarah as a Malaysian, I know there's a lot of tension, conflict about ownership of Enrique. And that's really something that's interesting, that I think is really interesting to break down. I think like I mean, Enrique obviously did not belong in a time where there were nations. But for me, in a similar way, I felt like the camera was not necessarily a citizen of any nation, just like Enrique. But like Enrique, he was or it was also a messenger, right? It was a vessel for our stories. And like Enrique, who was able to translate for Magellan across the archipelago, right? Across Nusantara. Um, we the camera was also able to translate everyone's thoughts and feelings into this videographic format. um uh, I kind of ended up not talking about the camera a bit more in the final cut of the film, but I did leave a small Easter egg if in the Bangkok episode when Pauline's daughter was using the camera, she was saying, "Hi Enrique, this is Bangkok." If you noticed that, yeah.
Oh, that's adorable. Uh, Kenneth?
I didn't really quite treat the camera as a more than human person. Uh, I really just treated it as a camera, um, or maybe not. I mean, I tried to take the camera along with me on what my days were like in Toronto, best as I could. I haven't, full disclosure, I have not actually seen the film again. I cannot stand my own voice, and yeah, so yeah, yeah. So I have no idea what I did actually. Yeah, I'm
Okay.
sorry. Yeah, you did an amazing job editing, but I just can't stand the sound of my own voice.
It's okay, Kenneth. I totally relate. I don't like listening to myself, to recordings of myself as well, which is ironic.
I know. Well, your films are very confessional, lady. But okay, so I do know that, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, since we're still talking about the camera. AD, you gave them some instructions, right? And Kenneth told me that he kind of went against the instructions a little bit. And I would love to hear more about that, especially because I know that Kenneth, you wanted to share other people's stories a little bit more. So AD, could you tell us a bit more about like what you asked them to do, and then what Kenneth, what you did not choose to do? By the way, I also see that there's some really good questions popping up, and we will get to you guys to those questions a little bit. But especially for the ones that are more concerned with immigration and the blue collar diaspora experiences, I think like Kenneth might also have some input on that.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so, uh, sorry, what's the main question again?
What did you tell them to do?
Oh, yeah. So, I sent the camera. I didn't send out instructions. I sent out a guide. It was basically like a PDF of basic camera work, like being mindful to keep the camera steady, like placing it on the base and whatever. So technical stuff like that. But also, I included a list of questions that we could possibly talk about when we do the interview, but also things that they could start thinking about when they're shooting their lives. But besides that, everyone basically had free reign of what they wanted to do. Everyone shot a lot of footage, and then when the footage came back to me and then I reviewed them, I began to see like themes in each story, and I asked each of them. I shared rough cuts of each segment to them, thinking, "Hey, this your footage made me think of this theme in particular. What do you think of it? Please feel free to edit and change." And and I also gave them free reign to reshoot or re-record some things if they didn't if they wanted to change it. Yeah. Yeah. And I just kind of wanted to address the one of the questions by Irene and what you mentioned as well, Maria, about the blue collar work. So my positionality and my friends' positionalities were at the top of my on my mind from the very start of the film. I realized that although I have a very similar migration story to everyone else, I'm not completely representative of the Filipino migration story. And so that's why I from the very start of the film, I wanted to tell my story, how I came to be, how I became a state scholar, and how that informed my perspective as I moved across the world. So I can't speak about the entire Filipino diaspora, but I can share my own perspectives on it, and this project was a way to let others be able to share their perspectives as well.
Kenneth?
Oh yeah, I really, really was conscious of the extent that I was not my story was not representative of the narratives of Filipino migration that we are familiar with, and my approach to creating the raw footage was to try and address that as best as I can. But that was slightly at cross purposes with the overall story of the film. And the interviews that we did, they're still there. I definitely want to get those stories out. And the reason I say this is because it's getting harder and harder for me personally, to speak of a monolithic Filipino migration experience. And Toronto just demonstrates this lesson beautifully. Filipino languages, not just Tagalog, are some of the fastest growing languages in Toronto. Certain occupations are dominated by Filipinos, especially care work. My partner's sister and her mom both worked as nurses in the Greater Toronto area, and on their my partner is also Filipina. She was born in Jeddah, so her own story is very global in ways that aren't neatly captured by pre-existing categories. But my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law have revealed to me that baon, the word for packed lunch, is now it's now entered the lingo of healthcare workers in Ontario. It's like people know what baon means. Yeah. The other thing that I'd like to say about Toronto is a few other things. So Ontario has two parallel public school systems. One is a secular public school system, and the other is the Catholic school board. And that was originally a concession to French Canadians, yeah. But with the decades and with migration, there's been an ecological succession of Catholics at these schools. Like first it was the Italians and the Portuguese, and the latest generation, you see lots of Catholic public schools in Toronto. More than half of the student population are Filipino. And this creates both issues for the educators who might not necessarily be working at the same speed as the patterns of immigration, as well as opportunities for a kind of cultural ferment. I personally believe, no offense to the South, no offense to Hawaii, no offense to the West Coast of the US, but the best Filipino food outside the Philippines is presently in Toronto. And that's because there's just this flourishing, of the Filipino experience here. And so, yeah, I think there's glimpses of it in the film, but yeah.
Actually, I really appreciated having your narrative or your camera experience first, Kenneth, because when I first watched this film, I was already I'm sorry, AD, but I was already suspicious about the fact that it's a bunch of state scholars who have been giving the opportunities, talking about their migration experience, and you giving that kind of more that kind of wider sense of narrative, especially from other positionalities in terms of the global labor processes that Filipinos are implicated in, and the kind of transnational interconnective ways under which we have to navigate our migration experience. You do kind of provide that framing at the beginning of the film before the specific narratives for each of the panelists, which I really appreciated when I watched it. When I watched it twice. The first, again, the one that was in progress, and I think AD and I talked a little bit about that when he was still in the process of editing. And following that, I do want to know a little bit more about how, like, each of your friends, each person who participated in this film, kind of highlight different issues in terms of their diasporic experience, right? And I'd like to know, like, could you talk a little bit more about that, AD? I don't know if Kenneth knows what was going on since he hasn't watched the film, but AD.
About my friend's diasporic experience?
And the specific kind of subjects or issues that they kind of highlighted for us there.
Yeah. So like I said, the issues that they highlighted just came out after editing the segments, and I really appreciated Kenneth's segment, since it was the first one, and since it just happened organically. Like I logistically, like, Kenneth had to be the first one because Toronto was the closest city to Seattle, and so he was going to be the first segment no matter what happened. But it just so happened that he shot, this whole entire documentary basically, and basically Kenneth's footage could be a standalone documentary if you wanted it to be, and I would definitely love to help you make that a reality, Kenneth. But basically just giving a bigger context, right? A bigger historical context, and contextualizing our experience as state scholars vis-a-vis the experience of other Filipino migrants. And I'm really glad that he was able to address that early on. And I think that definitely set the tone for the other segments, and which is, something that I realized making this film, that I didn't realize before, was that it made me wonder, like, maybe, white collar labor, migration isn't as free as, initially thought. Like, there were, through my our friend in Singapore, and our friend in Singapore, and even the one in France who used to live in Singapore, there have been systems in place to extract white collar labor from the Philippines, from state scholars, to move to other places, not just Singapore. So that was one of the many themes that I realized in this film, and which is actually really helpful in my dissertation writing right now.
Is there something you want to add, Kenneth?
Oh, more and more, I'm thinking of this now more and more in terms of commonalities rather than differences. That whole, there's a meme circulating over the past few weeks of how the idea of unskilled versus semi-skilled and skilled labor it's basically a tool of oppression. This sort of notion that there are blue collar and white collar and pink collar migrants from the Philippines, and them having different positions, it's true to an extent, but it also obscures other truths. I think in the case of AD and I, at the very least, as graduates of this high school, of the Philippine Science High School, we are also projects of high modernity. We were right up alongside other projects of high modernity and all their unintended consequences. Creating this science high school system was one of them. And the idea was, we are going to contractually obligate kids, 10 years old kids, 11 years old kids who passed an exam, to become scientists and engineers for the nation, which in practice meant that a lot of our classmates went on to amazing, well-paid careers in extractive industries, or in multinational corporations, or no, I'm getting ahead of myself there.
No, good.
But it must be recalled that the current pulse of outbound migration, especially the OFWs who went to the Middle East in the 70s, and healthcare workers as well from the 90s onwards, there were also, to greater and lesser extents, a project of high modernity, or at least working within the constraints of the late 20th century as the Philippines. And if I start seeing my own experience in terms of those commonalities, what emerges for me is that me and all the other migrants of the Philippines, we are residues of a failed revolution. To use the Walter Benjamin line, that every fascism is a residue of failed revolution. We were promised a very, very different country. The contract, I think, that I was forced to sign at 10 years old or 11 years old, that was the bargain. I'll be a part of nation building, but I do not want to be a part of this community. It's at least the nation as it's conceived by Duterte, for example, as conceived by the Marcoses, that I do not want any part of that. So I think a lot of people who leave the Philippines also increasingly do not want to be a part of that project. And that I think is also an important part of the story of Filipino migration. Recall that a lot of opposition to Marcos' rule was from overseas, on the West Coast, in the Beltway as well. And I think that process of migration as creative refusal, as walking away, because we do not want what's happening here, and we'll find a way to change it from outside. That's always going to be an important story of migration. You cannot just ignore that.
I love that you brought that up, because that's actually related to the next question that I want to ask the two of you, especially because you have this tension between national or state ideology, as experienced by the state scholar, of course, and the kind of I lost my train of thought, but the kind of complicity, right, that not you, like we enter in neoliberal labor flows as diasporic or migrant Filipinos, as we kind of disperse everywhere, right? In really historically based routes that and migrant routes that have been predetermined or for a lot of Filipinos, including ourselves. So I want you to kind of, if I could ask, like I would love to hear more about the kind of tension between state ideology and complicity in neocolonial and neoliberalism.
Am I defending my dissertation right now? No, thank you for the question, Maria. Yeah, it's definitely something that I'm exploring and researching more on in my dissertation, which looks at the history of Filipino migration across the Pacific during the 20th century, both during the American colonial period and after. And like what you said, what I'm slowly realizing is that this spontaneous in transnational migration that we're experiencing right now actually has its roots in deeper colonial intra-imperial migration. Thinking about just thinking about Hawaii, for instance, and Filipinos are still moving to Hawaii every year until today, not only for greener pastures but also to reunite with their families who have settled there, and these roots would not have been possible if the Hawaii Sugar Planters Association did not start those first routes and engage Filipino laborers to sail across the sea to this land of glory, which is Hawaii. Yeah. How about you, Kenneth? What do you think?
Let's return to the question again. Could you restate the question, Maria? I was sort of following AD's train of thought there, but I might be.
I was actually mostly jumping off on what you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
And I would like to talk to I would like to hear from you a little bit more about this tension between working with state ideology and our complicity in neocolonial and neoliberal labor flows as migrants Filipinos, especially because these are rooted in these have historical roots in colonialism and in.
I mean, more and more, I'm starting to believe that the Filipino state is itself very colonial. It's very extractive. Despite its ostensive origins in anti-colonial struggle, which our history texts remind us of year in, year out, a lot of that really is cover for policies of extraction against Mindanao, against indigenous peoples of the Philippines against working bodies of Filipinos deployed overseas. Under these circumstances, I think a blind love for nation, I'm not even talking about love for the administration, nationalism, patriotism itself needs to be questioned. What imagined community do I belong to now? I do not necessarily believe that I belong to the imagined community of the Republic of the Philippines. Like once we start looking at its notions of what belongingness means, a lot of it is ripe for, is overdue for re-examination. It's racist. It's uh, it's it unduly emphasizes the role of or the role of Christianity within the notion of belonging. It cannot help but create leader worship, which Filipinos, I think, are less capable of being critical of. I think we need to take a step back and see what it looks like in other countries where this is seen. I turned personally to two films about Indonesia, The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, as great examples of what an ostensibly anti-colonial nationalism is capable of doing, because lots of similar stories happen to the Philippines. They just haven't been told as widely as they deserve to be. So am I complicit in any of that? I don't know. I don't think so. I would rather see what I do as an act of refusal. I personally like to see that I still have solidarities with people in the Philippines, but that solidarity is not on the basis of nationality. If anything, that solidarity is on the basis of being under the shared oppression of what is in many ways, a very nasty central government.
I think what we always forget is that nation is a very modern invention, right? And we kind of have to always consider that when we are thinking through our experiences, our identities in terms of Filipino-ness. Two last questions before I jump into the questions of our audience, because there's some really good ones that I would love to hear both of you speak about. But in a completely different track, this film was edited in the midst of the pandemic, and this is something I really found interesting. The juxtaposition between stasis or in Hawaii that AD was experiencing versus the transit that was occurring in the film itself. And I would love to hear more about that juxtaposition between stasis and movement, especially because you were talking about the notion of position earlier as something that is both that is also about that sense of movement. So, AD and I guess Kenneth.
Yeah, definitely. So when I sent out the list of guidelines, I didn't really tell the participants to shoot movement, but it somehow just organically happened, right? And even when we were talking with each other in our conversations, our conversations somehow end up on mobility. Like a lot of the complaints of myself and my friends were about the traffic in Manila, which I reveals how Manila centric we all were, but also like you know it's also interesting that we were so ready to compare that with the infrastructure within the cities that we have now. And I think it goes to show how important mobility is for us, and not just like place wise, but also like career wise. Like a lot of people a lot of participants felt that they weren't going anywhere in their career if they stayed in the Philippines, as well. And yeah, I think when I was editing this in the pandemic, I part of my drive to finish editing it was to see that movement that I missed, while being cooped up in my apartment at the time. But I think it definitely speaks to um, the continuing need, at least in among me and my friends, and maybe our generation, like the need to keep moving.
Do you want to add anything, Kenneth?
Oh, lots. Just so happens that some of this is stuff I actually study. I'm studying big infrastructure, real estate, and so on, and how that is making money for the biggest Filipino conglomerates. And in retrospect, I wish I had studied too how the experience of traffic in Manila and the experience of public transit overseas amongst migrant Filipinos contributes to or is a part of political subjectivities. Yeah, because I don't know, it's such a fascinating thing to unpack, because for the typical middle Manileño, um, one of the most concrete forms of social mobility is for you to be able to afford a car. Yeah, so for you to become truly middle class, your family needs to have 2, 3, 4 different cars so that you can escape state regulations around the use of cars. So you can, it's a plate number based policy of restricting certain numbers to certain days and so on. But if you have multiple cars, that's not a problem, and you can be air conditioned coming from point A to point B. But that experience is quintessentially, it's an individuating experience, right? Like it insulates you from contact with other people. Your car is really in miniature your home, right? So when you experience assaults or perceived assaults to that car, you feel it as a perceived assault on your home, and you see this in the attitudes of car driving Manilenses. They take a very anti-public stance towards the city, and I think there's this desire there, this libidinal force there, that people would much really rather have a city where they don't need to drive. Yeah. That desire, that impulse is in part captured by the biggest conglomerates and certain politicians who promise big mass transit infrastructure, but they also give it a generous drizzle of authoritarianism. That if you want to have good mass transit infrastructure in the Philippines, what you need is a strong leader, an authoritarian. You need all these LRT lines that were built under Marcos or Duterte or whatever. But there is, I think, something that can be recuperated from that desire. And I think that the core of that desire is a desire for a public. There's the desire for third spaces, for cities that actually allow for us to be in contact with other people, to be in encounters with other people. So certainly that was, I think that's a core part of the experience of many Filipino migrants, seeing that cities don't have to be like Manila. It just so happens that a lot of the times the lesson that is being drawn from that is, well, if we don't want to be Manila, we want to be Singapore, or we want to be Dubai. We'd much, I think there's a way of telling these stories about other cities that allow us to arrive at a much more convivial way of living together. Wasn't it the mayor of either Curitiba in Brazil or Medellin? I think it was the mayor of Medellin who said that the mark of a rich city is when everybody takes public transport, even the rich, right? And that's something that I would love to have for Metro Manila. I would love for Metro Manila to have a clean, efficient, but ultimately free and accessible public transit system. I would like for car prices to in Metro Manila to actually reflect the cost they impose on everybody else. Instead, we have some of the cheapest cars in the world for a country that imports most of its gas and most of its automobiles.
I would love to see that also on a transnational scale, right? That kind of flow of movement where, I mean, we know that the prohibition from movement is also from a transnational perspective is kind of similar in that sense as well. That only a particular segment of society can move if in a more, at least in a more deliberate way. I don't know what I'm saying. But as a final question, oh yes, AD, go ahead.
Oh yeah. Well, you and Kenneth were talking. I just suddenly remembered, our friend in Singapore, that Singapore episode where, too much mobility can like severely harm your health. He was moving too fast. He was working too fast, and in a city where everything was so efficient that buildings only have a lifespan of a few years before they're torn down and reconstructed again. So I think, and I'm also glad that our film was able to capture a moment in time. So I think our friend in Singapore at the time was among the last of those Filipinos who were allowed into Singapore for white collar labor. I think since then Singapore has really tightened its immigration policy. Yeah, just things that suddenly popped up in my mind.
So as a final question before we move on to our audience's questions, because I really want to hear you guys talk about it a little bit more. I guess going back to your original title for the film, which is Where We Are Now. Was that the original title?
Yeah.
Which is scrapped. And I would love to know, like, what has changed since you've made this film? Because this was in 2014, 2015. And then it's 2022, and so much has happened in between those two points in time. So instead of asking you where you are or we are now, I would like to ask, like, where are we going?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question.
Saan tayo papunta, AP?
That's too hard a question,
Okay.
Maria. But I love it. I think we are working towards a more mobile and more equitable world, whether nations allow us to have it happen or not. I think that's where we're moving towards. Filipino migration isn't just the history of Filipino migration isn't just a story of laborers, being directed to where the state or the economy needs them. It's also a story of renegades trying to escape state, state surveillance, and a lot of Filipino migrants live precarious lives, and I think even grad students live precarious lives. Speaking from experience, and it's and this precarity is what drives many of us forward. Just looking for better opportunities, better places to explore who we truly are, or who we truly want to be. Yeah.
Do you have an answer for that question, Kenneth?
I have a very, very long answer for that. That's all I do now, thinking about where I'm going and where we are going as a people, as fellow migrants, as a planet. That's all I do now. I mean, I want to jump off something that AD had said. The experience of an international graduate student is in many ways because of our own doing, because of how we portray our lives on Instagram. It looks much more glamorous than it actually is. Yeah. I am, for example, right now, I am out of status. And you know why? Because it was the university in the middle of the pandemic decided that they want that I could no longer enroll an additional term. And therefore my papers were not put in order. You know the drill, right? But in that moment, I got the realization that, you know what, even well-meaning, very well theorized people, when push comes to shove, and as borders and as carceral logics proliferate, sooner or later, a person in authority will act as the border. Sooner or later, a person in authority will act as a cop. Yeah, even if they are immersed in theory. I also happen to work in a field, economic geography, urban geography, where for you to be heard, you need to be white. And not just a particular kind of white, you need to be white in this sort of placeless, ephemeral, transcendent way, Like you need to be speaking from above. That God trick of being able to theorize. Well, I'm too brown to theorize. That's a problem, Like I only have stories. I only have case studies. So you attend these conferences, you attend these summer schools, you go to coursework, and the predominant sense is, you know what, you don't belong here. Your knowledge is not valid, and fair game, because the university more and more is obviously a place of predators, a place of extraction, a place where colonial logics are very firmly entrenched. So the past decade for me has been a very, very long process of pre-partum anxiety. I take a good look around at the people around me. I do not want to become them. I do not want to be a theorist. I do not want to generalize and abstract from the position of God trickery. But at the same time, I have lots to unlearn. There's lots still for people in my position to actually be able to tell the stories that matter. And to that end, I ended up turning to a beautiful Filipino word, pakikipagsapalaran. Pakikipagsapalaran. Pakikipagsapalaran literally means to test one's fate. And in Tagalog, it's usually used in the context of talking about rural to urban or international migration, i.e., makikipagsapalaran ako sa Maynila. I'm gonna test my fate by migrating to Manila, or makikipagsapalaran ako sa Saudi. I'm gonna test my fate by migrating to Saudi. But more and more, I want to invoke a sense of pakikipagsapalaran as a way of unlearning capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism across the global south and across the archipelagos of people who need to move to survive. Yeah. To see the other. I am the other as well to all these theorists. So I might as well find my position with the others. So let's go find our position with the others as fellow travelers. People who are undergoing travails like our own. Let's make the path clear as we walk together and as we share stories of where we come from, and make the path where we wish to go. That's all I think about now. Yeah.
Katie, do you want to say something?
Oh no, I just love that concept of pakikipagsapalaran, and it's so apt. I think it's very relevant, especially in Hawaii, right? Where, where migrants are trying to figure their positionality vis-a-vis, the Kanaka Maoli, the indigenous people of this land, struggling for their own sovereignty. So what does it mean to be a migrant, who has been placed in the land because of settler colonialism? The opportunities were brought about by settler colonialism, and how to, you know, how do you um, how do you remake that? How do you revisit that relationship so that you and other colonized peoples are nakikipagsapalaran?
Yeah. I want to echo that. Like, I really love that you brought up that word, Kenneth. It's because it's a very relational word that is indicative of the shared struggle of a lot of people in their spaces and in their forms of movement. So I'm going to end our discussion so that we can talk with the questions that the audience have given us. I think AB has started answering some of them. So I'll ask the one that you haven't answered yet, AD. And if there are any other questions that you would like to ask Kenneth or AD about the film or about any of the topics that we've discussed, please just ask them or raise your hand. I think Sarah will put you in the video. So Karen Jolly is asking about languages and the switching in interviews back and forth between English and Tagalog or other languages. Was this part of the interview prompt, or is there a pattern that you saw in language choices? Oh, this is interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Jolly. Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, and the answer is very simple. It's how we talk as Tagalog Manileños who are educated, college level. We speak with a very cosmopolitan Tagalog accent, perhaps interspersed with English words. And in when so when I'm conversing with my friends and even with Maria, we that's how we normally speak.
Yeah, we generally speak in Taglish. That's our native tongue. Would you like to? So there's another question by Irene that you have not yet answered. Would you like to touch on that? From your research on immigration to other countries of Filipinos from the 1800s or 2022 immigrants, did you find any similarities of their goals or missions and outcome, or where are they now? How they accepted the new home, so to speak?
Thank you, Irene. Just speaking about my own research and my own experience, definitely there are a lot of similarities. Although although times change and motivations change, there is a lot of I think there is a lot of similarities in the differences. I think people move because of better opportunities, but also people move because of family, to create or to reconnect kinship ties. People Before this film, I made a short film called Tumanong Carlos, which is basically about me ruminating about my experience migrating, and comparing it with Carlos Bulosan's experience migrating. And definitely there are a lot of similarities: the pain of alienation, of being minoritized, being discriminated upon. But there are also a lot of differences. Like Carlos Bolosan and I don't come from the same province. We don't speak the same language except English when he arrived and when he learned it. We don't have the same social circumstances. So yeah, long story short, yes and no.
Kenneth, would you like to add anything to that?
Not really, because it's not my area of study. Yeah.
Okay. So we have a question from, we have another, we have a question from Ben Kirkland. I hope I'm pronouncing that. I'm probably mispronouncing it. I'm so sorry. Will this be a long-term project? Are you going to return and ask the same informants in 2030?
Hi, Manong Ben and Manong Linda. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for the question. Right now, it isn't a long-term project for, at least for us. Although I think Kenneth does want to work further on creating a documentary about, life in Filipino life in Toronto. Maybe Kenneth, you could talk a bit more about that. But I think the idea of the film is to, share our stories and inspire others to share theirs. So if there is going to be another iteration of this project, I invite others to to do them. And because I mean, we're just a few state scholars, elsewhere in the world. What about, nurses? What about domestic workers? In elsewhere in the world. I would love to see those stories as well. And with our technology today, it's a lot easier to do that now. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just ride off of that, because I don't want this to be I don't want this to be a lifelong project, because my life isn't that interesting, really. I'd like the stories of people around me are much more interesting, and it's amazing that the technology is now there to make it so easy. There's a couple of amazing premises for Filipino films that these are films I've yet to watch, but I think they speak to some of these themes that AD was talking about, like the stories of nurses, for example. There's this one film, and again, I've not seen this. The premise is just amazing. It's called Lumapit Ka Sa Akin Paraiso. It's by a Toronto-based, I believe, Filipinx director named Stephanie Comilang, and it's about nurses, or no, sorry, domestic workers in Hong Kong. And as with AD's film, the camera is a character. In this case, I believe it's a drone named Paraiso. And then there's this other film that is made by Dubai-based Filipinos, which is it's called Panahon ng Ligalig. And it's about, I just stumbled on this because I looked up where AD had shown this film in other film festivals, and the premise is amazing. It's about a Marano family in the 1970s taking in Vietnamese refugees. So yeah, set this in the fall of South Vietnam, or the unification of Vietnam period, and boat people migrating out into the South China Sea, and the Marano people themselves subjected to immense oppression by the Central Philippine state taking them in. And I believe it's focused on the story of women in this case. And as an additional layer, it's made by Filipinos who are based in Dubai. I'd love to see this film, and I think there's this sort of ferment of really interesting stories from the Filipino diaspora. Yeah.
We have this really interesting question from Sonia Zabala. What role or roles do you envision migrants and immigrants, Filipino travelers engaging with native, Aboriginal, or indigenous peoples throughout the archipelago, Hawaii, Canada, Alaska? And I think this is a very important question, especially for those of us who are studying in the settler spaces.
I think Kenneth's concept earlier of pakikipagsapalaran is an apt way of positioning ourselves. We're just we're fellow travelers, fellow life travelers in life, and as people who have also been colonized and brought to other places, or engaged to go to other places because of these enduring colonial roots. And I think uh, migrants what migrants can do is to side with other fellow colonized peoples, just like what Kenneth said earlier, in a much more profound and succinct way than I am communicating now.
Kenneth, do you want to add anything to that?
We just gotta start. We just gotta keep listening, keep telling stories with each other. Definitely, there has to be an effort, a capital E effort, especially when, at least speaking from my own experience, the curriculum is very much colonial. The reading lists are very much colonial. The approach, the university itself is very colonial. So there needs to be a bit of effort on our part to do that. It's not impossible, and I wish I had done it earlier. We will be working against the colonial grain. It's so much more easier to try and mold ourselves in the categories that empire would like us to be. Yeah. Speaking, I think a lot of us here are graduate students. That part publish or perish impetus, becoming the model migrant. Seriously, we should let go of that. We should let go of that. We should just be focusing on listening to people with whose stories might not be the same as ours, but whose lives, whose experiences, whose histories betray the refraction of the same sort of colonial, imperialist, capitalist, patriarchal impulses. And the more we learn across these artificial categories, the stronger we become. And by we, I don't mean Filipinos and migrants. I mean we in the archipelago of peoples of the global South. Turn the third world into a third space. There's this immense potency in that idea, right? Like that if all of us peoples of the third world refuse to be the first world, refuse to become first world, and then realize that all these carinderias, these dongs, these campfires, these random encounters on the street are where it's at, are where the stories that matter are. We bring those together. Well, first world is overdue for an apocalypse anyway. So,
And that's true. They should start experiencing the apocalypse that we've all been experiencing already. Last question before we go. Pakikipagsapalaran is to try and challenge oneself to luck. Oh, this is from Adrian Alarilla. Would you consider this attitude as gambling one's life?
I think it is. In many ways, I've gambled my life. When I moved to Hawaii a few years ago, it was a big gamble. But I think for many Filipinos, it's also a measured gamble. Filipinos won't tend to not go anywhere where there aren't any relatives or there aren't other fellow Filipinos. So, you know, um, Filipinos are cautious adventurers, maybe, or at least a lot of people I've met in the diaspora are. Yeah.
Oh, I like that question because it gets to something that I have a problem with myself. Like there's almost there's definitely a masculinist sort of tinge to the idea of pakikipagsapalaran that I'm still testing this idea out for myself. But I think AD gets to it exactly. Like it's not just it's not about gambling with one's life necessarily. It's entrusting one's fate even to loved ones, yeah, to a community of care, and I think there's always that connotation when somebody says makikipagsapalaran ako sa Maynila or sa Saudi, ipapaubaya ko na lang sa Diyos or whatever. What is being, I think, what is trying to come out and what is left semi unsaid is a trust that there will be community, that we will find community, and I think that process is immensely radical. Community is all we have, and I think the stronger it is, yeah, the richer our shared fates become. Pakikipagsapalaran.
I really love that. I love the idea that we are like we're the translation is not about luck, it's about fate, and we are struggling with the fate that has been determined for us, but we are struggling with it with our community. So
we're struggling to create a common better fate.
Yeah. And I love that this is this is a great way to end our discussion. Thank you so much, AD, for such a wonderful film. I'm not sure, is it still on, is the screening still ongoing?
Yes, I think until the end of today. Yeah.
Okay, so the screening is still ongoing. You can catch Kung Saan Man Tayo through the link in the Center for Southeast Asian Studies website, or then the Vimeo link. And thank you again so much, AD and Kenneth. I'm so glad that I was able to have this conversation with you. I hope to have more conversations with you too, Kenneth. I mean, I always have conversations with AD, but I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about all of these things.
Yeah, and to everyone too who attended tonight, who was here, thank you very much. But if any of this resonates, please get in touch with any of us. I think it'd be great for this to just be an ongoing thread, if that's at all possible.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Maraming salamat.
I think they've left.
Yes.